Barnbow Lasses, Part 3. Jazz's head of year glanced quizzically at her, then tried to help by telling the hall full of year 8s what Jazz was about to do. Jasminda has been doing some research into the soldiers of the First World War as part of her citizenship project. She's now going to tell us a bit about it before we hold a minute's silence for the men who lost their lives during the war. Jasminda. Jazz glanced at Mrs. Milner, then at the figure standing beside her. Edith Sykes. She had come. And the look in Edith's eyes gave Jazz something she'd never felt before, the need to tell people something important that they might not know about, even though she was scared. It gave her the courage to speak in public. I've been doing some research into soldiers from Leeds, Jazz said, hesitating to glance at Edith, at her yellow skin, her familiar frown. Soldiers who went to fight in the First World War and never came home. But I hope these soldiers don't mind, and I hope they know I respect them equally. But today I want to talk about some other war heroes. Jazz noticed that Mrs. Milner had shifted onto her front foot, like she was going to walk from the side of the hall and make Jazz stop. I want to tell you about some people who used to live around here, Jazz went on. People who gave their lives to their country too. Jasminda studied the 200 faces in front of her. She didn't know what it was, but she could sense that the audience was puzzled, even interested in what she was going to say. The things she had learned that morning. During the First World War, she told them, we needed millions of shells to help us beat the Germans. Shells, if you don't know, are bombs that you can fire from big guns or mortars on the ground. The biggest shell factory in the country was here in Leeds, less than a mile from where we are now. Nearly 16,000 women worked there in 3 shifts, around the clock. Their job was to fill the shells with explosives, then screw the fuse onto the top and send it off to the front line. It was really dangerous work. They had to cover their hair, wear overalls, rubber boots and gloves, and they weren't allowed hairpins or jewellery that might cause a spark and disaster. But even so, Jazz went on, the chemicals in the explosives got to them, poisoned them, meaning they would be sick, they would have sore throats, would have blurred vision, and gradually they turned yellow. As they became more and more ill, people saw them away from the factory and they'd call them the Canaries. But the work they did was top secret. Nobody was allowed to talk about it, so the Germans didn't find out where this massive factory was. At 10:27 p.m, on the 5th of December 1916, a huge explosion was heard across Leeds, even as far as York. Inside the factory, a shell had accidentally exploded. And even though the factory had great walls of sandbags and sheets of metals to shield the war workers, it was a disaster. Jazz remembered what she'd seen in the factory that morning. There were dozens more injured, she went on, aware she was talking so fast she was to stop herself becoming emotional. The room was dark and cold and covered in blood and steam. Some died in the factory and others were taken to Leeds General Infirmary and died later. In all, 35 women were killed. It was the largest female loss of life in the whole war. There's a memorial to them in Manston Park. You know, the one up from the shops. Jazz swallowed and looked at the floor. She was feeling more and more upset, surprised she'd got this far without crying, and was determined to finish, to do it for the Barnbow Lasses, for Edith. Courage. She had to show courage, like they had. After the explosion, the factory was cleaned up, and within hours, other women volunteered to work in part of the factory where so many of their fellow shell fillers had died to win the war. And after their shift, when the women were asked what the explosion had been, they couldn't tell the truth. The factory had to be a secret. When their deaths were announced in the newspaper, all of that could be said for each woman or girl was that they died by accident. Now that they had died not that they had died for their country. One of the women, girls, was 15. Her name was Edith. Jazz stopped. too upset to go on, half expecting someone in the audience to laugh. But no one did. They were transfixed by Jaz's story. Jaz glanced at Edith, still stood beside her. "Edith Sykes," Jaz gasped. And where I live, there are 9 roads named after the Barnbow Lasses. I live on Edith Sykes Drive," she said. Jaz couldn't speak. She feared she wasn't quite making sense anymore. She tried her best and now looked into the eyes of Edith Sykes to see that her frown was gone. And it was, because Edith Sykes was smiling. Now Mrs. Milner came to stand alongside Jaz. Jaz faced her, half expecting to be told off for not doing what she'd been asked to do, until she saw that her head of year had tears on her cheeks and that she was nodding. Mrs. Milner put her hand on Jaz's shoulder and smiled. "That was excellent, Jasminda. I'm so sorry to stop you, but it's nearly 11 o'clock. "The minute's silence?" Jaz asked. "Yes," Mrs. Milner said gravely. "Yes, so if everyone would like to stand, we're going to hold a minute's silence to reflect on everyone who gave their lives for this country in wartime, for the soldiers, the sailors, the airmen, and of course, for the Barnbow Lasses." Standing now, everyone watched as the second hand moved to the top of the clock. Some looked at the clock, others at their feet. Some closed their eyes and some stared to the front of the hall. Looking back at them, Jaz watched the Year 8's faces change in astonishment, their mouths opening, nudging each other. Some gasped. There was a strange, unearthly silence in the hall. Even the teachers had their hands to their mouths. What was this? At first, Jaz looked down at herself. Was she still wearing her slippers, her pyjamas? No, it wasn't that. And then she wondered, had they seen Edith? Jaz turned to look at the ghost of Edith Sykes and felt her legs almost buckle at what she saw before her. This was what the Year 8s and teachers were so astonished at seeing. Jaz took in a gasp of air, tried not to make a sound because she was not looking at Edith Sykes, the ghost of the Barnbow lass who had guided her around the terrible disaster site, but at 34 other women too, all in caps, covering their hair, dark overalls, all faintly yellow, all staring back at the children with looks of courage and pride on their faces.